Well, welcome to everybody to yet another installment of the Willson Center Cinema Roundtable. I've been hosting these for about 25 years now, and I just really want to thank the staff, Nicholas Allen, who's on the panel today, Dave Marr, who is behind the scenes doing everything, and Winnie Smith. They are three people who keep the Wilson Center going. It's one of the great resources on our campus, and it helps all of us. So thanks very much. Every semester, we try to come up with at least one roundtable, sometimes several, things that will interest people in different departments. So they're interdisciplinary, sometimes about recent films like this one, sometimes about the past as well. And actually going forward, we're probably going to have two a semester, one more practical about filmmaking, since we have the new MFA in film and television production at UGA, and then one more of a historical type as well. The way it works is we'll have everybody start, and I'll introduce the panelists in just a minute. They make some statements about things that they find of interest. We have discussion among us, and you can ask things in the question and answer function, and we will get responses. Sorry we're not live, but this will be the last one ever that's a webinar, I promise as well. Everybody is always, very impressive on the panel. I don't do long intros or we'll never get going. So let me just do really brief introductions to everybody you see on the screen. Nicholas Allen is the director of the Willson Center on campus. He's a chaired professor in the Department of English. Oops. Oop. Hang on. Stop. There, sorry about that. My YouTube just kept going. Hang on. Okay, sorry. There. Anyway, that kept going. I don't know if you could hear, I hope not. Anyway, Nicholas Allen is not only from Belfast, much of his research is devoted to Irish culture as well. I'll just put out the title of two of his books to show how pertinent his work is for our panel today: Ireland, Literature and the Coast, Sea Tangled, and Modernism, Ireland and the Civil War. Thrilled to have him on a panel. He's often been at them. Peter O'Neill teaches in the Comparative Literature Department across the street from where I am right now, and works on the Irish diaspora, as well as transnationality, the global reach of Irish culture, etc. His books include Famine Irish and the American Racial State, and I'm really glad to have him included this semester as well. Kate Fortmueller. Kate teaches in Grady College's Entertainment and Media Studies program. She's also co-president of the Cine Movie Theater with me right now. She works on labor, gender, genre, and media. She had two recent books come out. One, Below the Stars, how the labor of working actors and extras shapes media production, and also Hollywood Shutdown. She wrote a book about media and the COVID as well. Sanghoon Lee is in his first year at UGA, so we should all welcome him. He teaches in the new UGA hub down at Fayetteville, so he doesn't get to come to Athens often enough for us, at the Trillis Studio site for our new MFA in film and TV production. He's a hardworking cinematographer, a specialist in black and white, so he's very pertinent for today. He's a writer, director. His feature film Banana Season came out in 2018. And again, we just all welcome Sanghoon to the panel and to Athens today. And then Tom Hiel. Tom Hiel is also a relatively recent hire at UGA. He teaches composition in the Hugh Hodgson School of Music. Tom has a very long list of music composition and orchestration credits, from feature films to documentaries to TV movies and shorts, including some of my favorites like Red Eye, but also things like Scary Movie 2 and Rugrats movies. It's a wide range of work he's done. We look forward to him working more with us on things like the Roundtable, but also with our MFA in film and TV production. So let's get going to talk about the movie. And again, whenever possible, people should really put things in the Q&A. I'll try to pay attention. So we thought we'd start with Nicholas Allen. He and I actually did a little discussion about the movie at Cine Movie Theater one night when it was showing there. Nicholas, do you want to get started on what interests you about Belfast, the movie, and its real contexts, if you wish?
Sure, and thanks very much. And it's lovely to be with my colleagues and friends. I'm sorry we're not in person, but Richard, you've done such a sterling job over the decades now in introducing film to campus and all its diversity. So thank you for that. Belfast, I suppose in one sense I could be the person to crank at the start that could point all the things out about the film that I didn't like about it. And then you're going to have Peter O'Neill, who's actually not from Belfast. He's a countryman from the second city of Derry, who's then going to tell you things about where he comes from. It was both worse and better, but I thought maybe I would ask you all some questions to think about the film because I watched it twice now and I felt about it very differently the second time that I watched it. So the first time, certainly, I did wonder, was it a film about Belfast at all? It's certainly not the city that I grew up in. There's virtually nothing of the city centre in it. And at the time when the film was set, the city centre was still a place where people went and shopped and lived and moved through. And there's very little sense of that transit. It's a very tightly filmed set of scenes. And it struck me, and Richard, you and I talked about this before, that might have partly to do with Kenneth Branagh's theatrical background. It felt very much like a theatrical stage set rather than it did a slice of urban life. Now you could hear the echoes of Belfast's speech, and I loved all that, ma da, all the stuff that was going on in the background. And of course, Van Morrison of ill repute, his music gives a certain kind of soulful transatlantic thread, which is also true to the history of the city. Certainly in World War II, the staging post for the liberation of Europe happened to a degree through the north of Ireland, where so many American soldiers and Navy servicemen were stationed, and that's very much imprinted in the culture afterwards. But I wondered, really, should the film have been called Carrickfergus or North Belfast? So it was very much set off on the limits of things. And I thought too, why now? The north of Ireland has become a very famous place for the making of visual work. Game of Thrones, most famously now, people have very much taken advantage of that. And even things that we were embarrassed about before, like the sinking of the Titanic, which was made in Belfast, and about which people said that it was all right when it left us, was something that wasn't really talked about for a long time. But after the film, of course, now we have a Titanic museum, a Titanic hotel, all of those things. But we've also had Brexit. And well, we've had this sort of Europeanization of the city, of this awareness of a place made from overlapping sovereignties. A lot of the last 5 years has been about attempts to reassert only one way of being in the north of Ireland, of it only belonging to one territory, of closing it off. Even though the people of Northern Ireland voted to stay inside the European Union, they were taken out. And so I thought, one of the things that I found very difficult about the film the second time I watched it, and I grew up in a very sympathetic British unionist household. My family has changed since, but certainly that was the life world I grew up in. But the degree to which the film struck me as being a kind of a balm that would have become inflamed again, the film was trying to cover over. And I think whenever you see that sort of semi-Western scene with the army at two sides of the street, whenever you see the family being given a lift home in the back of a Saracen, which is the armored vehicle, like, I know it's a fairy tale, but that really is a fairy tale. And I thought that gentleness was also dishonest, but not dishonest only in the sense that this wasn't how the army behaved or there were extenuating circumstances. But if you watch that film, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the troubles in the north of Ireland only started because only people in the north of Ireland started it. And that's not the case. It completely overlooks the extraterritorial conditions of colonialism, imperialism, the legacy of partition, the centenary of which is now. And in making a film about reconciliation, I thought that it was untrue in the deepest sense. Not that you could say that it wasn't in that street or in that street, or people don't say this or they don't say that, but that it made it look like the Troubles were an internecine affair. And that was the kind of narrative that I grew up with in the news. And it was a way of limiting people. It was a way of diminishing their ambitions and their thoughts and their hopes. And you can certainly get that in the film. And in a way, the older parents are the symbol of such diminished hopes. And the idea that you would leave at the end to find yourself, again, I wondered. Although I did cry the first time at the end quite unexpectedly, whenever the color scene came up of the gantries of the shipyard. But even the shipyard is itself a very historicizable and problematic place in terms of its histories back into the pogroms of Catholic workers from there in the 1920s. So I get that you don't want to inflame things, but I thought that there might have been other ways to tell the story that didn't require you to have a musical at a wake.
No, and that's fascinating. And in fact, as you're speaking, I was thinking also of the movie that this kind of responds to, which is Cuarón's Roma, which is set in his childhood in black and white in Mexico City, but he also calls it Roma because that was his neighborhood. rather than calling it Mexico. So in some ways, you're right. It is much more about a neighborhood as well. But it also, yeah, does make you think of the vast thing. And the thing about Roma also is it has this sort of sub theme of sort of fascism on the rise, and tries to suggest in a very different way some of the political problems going on, I think. No, that's terrific. Peter, do you mind to build on this in terms of, or react
I'll
as
pass you
well?
to our country correspondent.
All
I'm from the city of Derry, which was a city when Belfast wasn't even a bump in the road, I'll have you know. The true cultural centre of the north of Ireland. I loved Nicholas's analysis of the movie. I agree with everything, but I will say that I was surprised how much I liked the movie. Now I've only seen it once, but I have political objections to it, for sure. But for me, I mean, I grew up in that time. I was knocking around as a wee fella in 1969 in a working class neighborhood, not unlike that portrayed in this film, you know, complete with, you know, the outside toilets and the close-knit communities. And even though, you know, it's very romanticized and maybe you could say cliched, I really enjoyed that, you know, evoking, you know, aspects of my childhood in it. And that was the most pleasing thing for me about it. And you know, Nicholas is the most, you know, galling thing for me about the movie was the way that indeed it portrayed the you know, the role of the British Army, for example. You know, in the movie they're seen as sort of keeping the peace, as sort of keeping those trouble, you know, the troubled sectarian mad Irish, you know, apart. And that isn't at all the way it was or the way it is. I suppose there's only so much you can do in a couple of hours, but I just coming away, the overall impression that the movie leaves you with is that it is, I think, as Nicholas pointed out, that it is some sort of sickness that is confined to the north of Ireland, and the bigger political questions are left unanswered. I mean, he obviously made certain choices and invented certain things. I thought the whole invention of the love affair with the young Catholic girl, them going to the same school, it just didn't ring true, because from an early age, kids in the north of Ireland are separated. They go to Catholic schools and Protestant schools. So I find that sort of peculiar choice in why he wanted to bring up. I suppose it is a way of bringing up sectarianism, but I think there were better ways of doing it. I suppose, you know, I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah, there's a whole history that we can go into in 1969 and the pogroms that happened in that particular time period where the film is set in. But perhaps we'll leave that for later on or for another time.
Well, no, and this is also really helpful. The segregation of kids may so that one scene where is it Frances, the cousin, when she's trying to talk to Buddy about how do you tell a Catholic from a Protestant, and it's by their names, and then they get confused. Yeah, that I assume that scene then would also seem kind of naive or not particularly realistic. Like, how do you tell them apart?
No, I mean it's one of the oldest. You know, it's a bit of a joke, isn't it, in the north about, you know, how do you tell a Protestant from the Catholic? Well, their eyes are closer together. Needs. I mean, those are things that kids would have said. I'm not saying that,
right.
but there wouldn't have been any experience,
Not-
really very little experience of Catholic kids and Protestant kids, and certainly not in a school setting.
growing up in that way. Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Cool. Well, before Kate, you get going, I just want to also remind people it's not only nominated for 7 Academy Awards, not that that always means something necessarily, but it's a movie that's gotten incredible attention for the screenplay. Lots and lots of best original screenplay prizes already from the Golden Globes, the British Film Group, the Irish Film Festival, Toronto, many other people. It's a lot of people really talking about the script and the cleverness of it, and the fact that it's made during COVID as well. So Kate, what would you like to talk about in terms of Belfast and or genre and gender, whatever cues you're interested in?
Yeah, I can. Well, I'll start with. I guess I might start a little bit with the, since you just talked about Oscar nominations, and I think I don't know if this is the right word. I don't know if this is exactly how I want to describe this, but when I did have a pretty distinct feeling of this movie feels like it has those kinds of elements of like a Hollywood spectacle, in that everything seems to be very intentional to the point of almost in competition, which means that like throughout this movie, I'm sort of watching it. It's like all the compositions are gorgeous, right? The lighting is gorgeous. This is they built this set, which is part of the claustrophobic feeling of that. But I think there's something kind of interesting what Nicholas Allen was saying about it sort of ends in a musical number. I feel like there's something that sets that up from the beginning in terms of having it being on this like studio street. So it's creating this kind of fantasy Hollywood version of Belfast in that way. But I think all of these aspects, and I guess the other thing I was kind of thinking a little bit about is that it's also a film that's about Kenneth Branagh's childhood or his childhood memories. So it's kind of, I think, nostalgic for people who miss films about people, not just films about Thor. Just to throw in another Branagh title. So I think some of those pieces of that are very much there, and I think is probably one of the reasons it's attractive, right, as an Oscar film, because it's a film about a director who's sort of been working for decades. It's a childhood story. I think it feels good in a moment where we don't feel very good about a lot of things. So I guess a couple of things I would sort of bring up just as quick notes, but I want to make sure we have time for other people's questions and things to talk about. But the things that I was thinking a lot about with this film, the kind of deep focus shots and the frames within frames that give you a sense throughout this film of somebody always watching, somebody always present, this kind of family unit that is always kind of together. And I think that's one of the things that when they're kind of moving, it's about moving from this close-knit family to kind of out into a world, and an unfamiliar world. As I was saying to Richard at the beginning of this, or before we started, it's a great reminder that the kind of like insular shooting doesn't need to be terrible, like all the pandemic media that we're seeing that is really unattractive and like ill-framed and like brightly lit. So you can really do things with people like in these kind of closed spaces that is really beautiful. I think the black and white does a ton of work for the nostalgia. I will let Sanghoon talk about that. And I think the last thing I would sort of just mention is I think one of the, I think like, there have been a lot of critics who have talked about the really idealized version of his parents. So this is a thread through the reviews, is that why are they so gorgeous? Why are they're just this beautiful couple whose parents really look like that? They're movie stars. And I think it's being read a lot as like, that's part of a child memory, that you remember your parents as being perfect and gorgeous and kind of walking on air. Obviously, that's a child's memory that speaks a lot to a very loving, stable household. But I think the kind of, despite this being sort of about the coming of age of a young boy and all his interests in Westerns and matchbook cars and all these little details, I think you do get this, you have these female characters that are guiding him at every step, which I think is whether that's grandma who's really kind of releasing them out, the mother who's the one keeping them financially kind of, I don't know, financially solvent maybe, and then the cousin who's a terrible influence on him, but sort of guides him through. So I think it is a sort of interesting, I guess, portrait of a young boy and his, in some ways, I like to think more of the relationship between him and like all the women in his life. So I like that part of the movie. So.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's. I mean, he's a terrific. I mean, not just a great actor. Where the heck they get that kid? I mean, who can hold those close-ups and stuff? And that he's really marvelous.
Yeah.
But it is. I mean, it really does try to be that child's point of view, where the kid does cry and throw fits, and he's not always heroic as well. If I was going to make a movie about myself, I don't think I'd put myself so whiny in there, right? So it wants to, but it does have a great child's perspective. There aren't that many great movies from a kid's perspective. It made me think of him like a little younger Antoine Doinel from Truffaut or something. But there aren't that many films that really try to keep that kid's perspective, and that you're right, that has helped motivate people to say, oh, everybody idealizes their parents. Give them idealized parents for the movie too.
And I was sorry, I was thinking about some of this in terms of like, what are the elements where it feels like it's trying to do neorealism kind of moments, which have oftentimes a lot of children and like children featured in it as like the hope of the new generation. And I don't think this movie is doing that at all, but I think you know, like the kid is a great actor. He does like all these great little like total, you know, like when he's in the Matchbox cars and like sorting through his cars, like there are all these kind of great moments and like detail moments to anchor that in it. But like that being said, I think no, I'm not going to like beat the dead horse about some of the political things, mostly just trying to add a few other things to the conversation.
Right, and just to make sure everybody out there understands too, when you mentioned Italian neorealism notion, there is that sort of working class in the streets. You've got, you always have those in great neorealist films. You got a sense that, well, outside your window, there's another family who's having those exact same problems just across the street, and you do get that community sense here too. But it's not raggedy and handheld, looking like Italian neorealism in any way. That's true, or with some of the ambiguity that they would have. Sanghoon is Kate mentioned black and white and some framing options. Would you like to say a little about the visual style, or just what black and white means these days to you?
Yeah, I think that Richard asked me to talk about black and white cinematography in 5 minutes, so I thought that's impossible. This is at least a half of semester discussion, but I will try as much as I could do. So first of all, I'm here for black and white cinematography. People would think, what is that Asian dude talking about? The Northern Ireland story. I grew up like 10,000 miles from Northern Ireland. But the one common thing is that in Korea, when I grew up, there's definitely the big struggle in between two groups always. And then as you imagine, North Korea, South Korea, in South Korea, there's a lot of class struggle, and it was chaotic when I grew up. So I think that cinematography is not just independent from the whole story. You have to understand the actual story and background and history to understand cinematography. So that made me study about Belfast and Northern Ireland in 1960s and 70s. That made me understand the deeper about this film. So I think before we go to this film, I want to talk a little bit about black and white cinematography since 2010, because as you remember, I think the big moment was the Artist in 2011, and then you got Best Picture in Oscar. And then before that, the Artist, we saw black and white film as some little spice here and there. And then since then, almost every year, we see, the Oscar contender black and white film. As you remember, Ida, 2013 Polish movie, Nebraska from Alexander Payne, and the Roma, of course, it got big. It got first time Best Picture and Best Cinematographer. Who does that, right? I'm so jealous. I don't know how he does that. And The Lighthouse, all those films are nominated actually in Best Cinematography in Oscar too. And especially Roma and Mank last year, and then it got Best Cinematography. And this year there are 4 black and white films as an Oscar contender. As you know, Come On, Passing, and The Tragedy of Macbeth, and Belfast. The Tragedy of Macbeth was nominated as a Best Cinematography. I think the Belfast is phenomenal in cinematography, but sadly, it is not in the list. So what I'm saying is why, especially 2022, is like a blossoming of the black and white cinematography. So I thought about it, but personally, I love black and white cinematography. I shot 3 feature films, the black and white feature films, and then I love that. And then the first film was like a very similar as like a Belfast kind of artist, the artist kind of a look, very contrasty. And then even we had a spot color, the film called Chicago Heights in 2009, and there's some spot color in between majority of the black and white cinematography. So I thought about this phenomenon as a kind of a story of look, because we talk about the look, right? Sometimes say film look, and then sometimes we use some certain director. If you think about Del Toro look, or some Wes Anderson look. So we talk about the look. Even filmmaker, when you pitch your project to someone else, and then lookbook is the requirement these days. You have to show what kind of a look, what kind of a style you want to create. So look is a kind of a visual value, I think, in certain era. It becomes a norm. So it is very psychological at the same time, very cultural. So when a student talk about that, I don't know much about the look, but I want kind of a neutral or natural look. But there's no such a neutral or natural look. So you have some kind of a value in your head as somebody who lives in 2020 in Georgia, Atlanta, or Athens. So how does this black and white become one of the norms in our visual world? I think that Kate mentioned the nostalgia, and then that is definitely one part. And then people are more and more far away from black and white film. But is that all? Just nostalgia gives people increasing interest to black and white film. I think the black and white film these days are adding not only nostalgia, but also fantasy. So what I mean by that is, okay, black and white is an old style. How come we can add the fantasy? Because basically film is something show to the audience that we cannot see, if you think about it. And then even realism film, we see it through the lens. So we don't see the telephoto lens kind of a look. We don't see wide angle look. And then we don't change the focus. We don't have a selective focus. So at the end of the day, film is a very selective lens control visual language. So in terms of that, and then black and white film, and then now these days, 2022, you see all the fantasy you can imagine, you can see it in the movie. All the superpower, flying, fire, ice and web, whatever you can imagine, you can see in the movie, right? And then black and white film is also something that you don't see with your eyes. So not only nostalgia, I think the black and white is becoming part of the fantasy because people don't know what black and white means these days. People don't see the black and white world. So it is kind of a very mixed and then also fascinating media it became. So nostalgia and fantasy, so at the same time. And then also black and white is a great tool for the certain subject, like passing, right? And then black and white issue, racial issue. And then Belfast, Protestant and Catholic, there's a really sharp social issue in there. And then black and white is, as you guys know, it's not color. When I say it's not color, of course, black and white is not a color. Basically, black and white is not part of the color. It's only tonality. It doesn't have any hue. So which means you can only control the visual very geometrically. That's all you have. So because of that, you can make the image much more focused in the certain character especially. When you have the really strong character-driven movie, I would consider black and white film all the time because you can make the certain character very much more the focus. So I think that with all that cultural social change, with the people sometimes tired of all that color, too much fantasy, and then black and white gives you different types of fantasy. So I think the Belfast is also like I mentioned, so 4 films Oscar contender this year. They are very different film. Come On is like a contemporary story, and Belfast 1960s Northern Ireland, and then the tragedy of Macbeth, kind of Shakespeare era, and Passing 1920s New York. So it has various time period. It's not only for the older story, like a Nebraska 2013 Alexander Payne. This is a modern story. and Francis Ha from Noah Baumbach, there's a modern story. So this modern story can be told with the black and white. So Belfast, of course, like Kate mentioned, a little bit of the beautiful composition, and they did a great job with the limit of the color. Of course, there's no color, only tonality, but lack of the color was totally compensated by a very rich use of the lens. And then if you remember, like a really wide angle lens, in the very opening sequence, camera is very fluid to move the characters and to follow the character. And then when he used the telephoto lens, a beautiful frame with a beautiful contrast when the buddy was talking to his grandpa at the hospital. And then also with a very interesting editing strategy, because usually when you edit, where somebody's talking, we show that person because audience want to see what that person is talking. But we see a lot of reaction shot because that makes think it happens all the time. And then when Buddy was talking with his mom, and then sometimes when Buddy was talking with grandmother on the way home from the bus, and then that happens many times. And then first time we see it, we're curious why we are not seeing the person who is talking. But later, we are slowly kind of realizing the style of that edit, and then we focus on that character more with much more attention. Because then we can sympathize more, because we see not only their dialogue, but also that person's, the reaction. So I think that was also very interesting, the visual strategic plan. And then of course, like a spot color, like we see spot color 3 times in the beginning, modern era, and then boom, camera goes up, and then we go into the 1960s Belfast. And then we see twice. Number 1 is A Christmas Carol, and then number 2 in the, another movie, right? And that gives a very kind of sad feeling because, only that play or only movie is colorful. Their life is much more very strong contrast with other group of people. It's like a live or death. And then when you are in the theater, you can only experience that, abundant color. So I think that was a very interesting choice of the black and white color. So I think that's kind of a very highlight of this black and white cinematography starting from, of course, it started from a long time ago, but I don't know when the last time for black and white film as an Oscar contender since, I don't know, last time was 1959 or something. I don't know, I just threw that number. I don't know. I didn't research it.
No, this is very helpful. And in fact, to see that as the number of black and white films is very low, but the fact that you point out how many are getting the awards for best cinematography, etc., is really striking. So they do have a certain cachet, certainly artistically and stuff. And actually, in a little bit, when we talk a little more generally, I also want to hear from Peter too. Like growing up, did you get to go to the movies? Did you go to? I mean, were they a special sort of escape like they were in this movie, or going to the play? So lending the color there for those films for those scenes is really important, obviously, in this movie. Terrific. Well, Tom, finally, let's talk about the soundtrack. And this, again, it's almost embarrassing to say, oh, here we got a composer, and you're going to talk about a movie where they just dropped in, for the most part, songs that were already known and popular. So yeah, I just hoping you'd be able to say something about the function of the music here, any reactions to use of Van Morrison, and there's a lot of silence in the movie too.
Jump in with some sort of fact.
Yes, factoid. 1971 Last Picture Show was the last black and white film nominated for cinematography. So yeah.
There we go. Well, with Belfast, obviously Van Morrison is an obvious choice because he's from Northern Ireland, so it's like, probably expected to use 1 or 2 songs or something like that. What Kenneth Branagh really did was he didn't use a composer. There was no real score, and he kind of scored it with these Van Morrison songs. And what he did by doing that is, because these songs are so, they're R&B based, they're pretty upbeat, it kept it sort of on this upbeat feeling all the way through the movie, in days like this and things like that. It just constantly, and then he didn't really have a composer sort of emphasizing sort of the dramatic elements of the film. I was telling Richard that I'm working on a film right now, and the director wanted me to watch 71 for the soundtrack, which is another film about Belfast, but a much different take on it. And it was scored by David Holmes, who's known for most, like the Ocean's 11 and that type of stuff. This sort of, but he did a very serious score for this, and it was very drum based, very guitar, minor keys, stuff like that, very kind of dour and serious, and this constant pulse all the way going through, and very, 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 very tense. But it works well for that movie where it's a British soldier is caught behind enemy lines and blah 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 blah, and it's a different story. Whereas this really, when you get down to it, and I talk to my students about it, what's the film really about? What in one sentence, what's this film really about? And it seems to me it's about family. If you just wanted to, and so in doing that, and these songs really work all the way through the film. Why not I think he started using some of them and then, found it really worked for his film. He didn't really want to emphasize these dramatic things. He wanted it to keep it about family. And then at the end, the Everlasting Love Song, was sort of the capper on the whole thing. Very upbeat, very, let's keep our family together, blah, 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 And so that's kind of my take on it. It really kept it light and fun. And I was on a Zoom, it was Kenneth Branagh talking, he was being interviewed by Guillermo, and he was talking about the film, but he actually mentioned that, where he's like, oh yeah, I wanted to keep it light. It's about my references to my childhood. The upbeat Van Morrison songs, really don't keep it on a certain level. Keep it warm and happy and that type of thing. And it wasn't really a happy time, but it's sort of emphasizing that family, I think. And it really does that pretty well, actually. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's true. And in fact, there are those really strong montages. They go to the park, and it's got like a Van Morrison thing while it's going to have, just a wide variety of things. And that's when we learned that the dad can do this William Tell thing and knock something off somebody's head that he's really good at throwing. But yeah, you got those montages when Buddy gets moved up, and is all proud to get moved up in the class. You got this, the Van Morrison is really what's going to give you the emotion as well as the kid's face.
Right.
But I just was really surprised the first time I saw it. I thought, oh gosh, lots of wall-to-wall music. And then the second time I thought, wow, there's a lot of silence in this movie. And I think that's also really daring, that you've got these long scenes where you're not quite sure, is it melodramatic and sad? Is it a little bit comical? So I put the performance is left a little bit more, I think, ambiguous in a couple scenes, partly because we don't have that wall-to-wall soundtrack as well.
Yeah, you don't really have a score that's pushing it one way or the other. And, that's the director's take on it. So it's like, he didn't want that. And
yeah.
And he just left it sort of cinema verite for for the dramatic scenes, or if you will. And then these Van Morrison songs just kind of kept popping in at the right time all the way through the film. And it works, and Van Morrison was popular, right around that time, and came up right around that time. I knew of him from college. In college we used to listen to him quite a bit, but it's really the late '60s and stuff like that, so it really works for that time. And then I think Nicholas was saying that one of the Van Morrison songs became a anthem for the Troubles being done or something. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That was something. So.
Yeah, and I don't know if Peter, if Peter, I don't know if you have more insight in terms of what Van Morrison means, to Northern Ireland, much less what it would have meant the late '60s. Yeah, there was one review I remember seeing something that said, it was almost like the real life soundtrack maybe for the era, and I just wasn't quite sure. Put your mic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Van Morrison was the natural choice for this movie, not only because he came up, as Tom said, during this time, brilliant music, but also he had a wide appeal across the sectarian divide, and there was also a sense of pride in Morrison having made it as a sort of a pop, if you like, a rock um, uh, rock star, and so people were and still are, despite his vax position, still are sort of proud of Morrison's achievement and putting sort of the Northern Ireland or the Irish music scene on the map. There weren't a lot of Irish rock stars, in the 60s or in the 70s, for that matter. And yeah, nostalgia. I think Nicholas was referring to one particular song. Yeah, and I can't remember now.
And I got to mention he has to leave town, so that's why he's dropped off.
Yeah, he always leaves
out of
me in
town.
it.
And I'm sorry, as long as you're talking. So do you want to say a little bit more about pop culture and entertainment? I mean, this is a movie
Yeah.
about watching TV. Going to the movies is a huge entertainment for them. To go out to see Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but then you also have High Noon to make that Western motif of Catholics versus Protestants, and or just the thugs versus the people who don't want to get involved as well. So I just didn't know if you'd say a little bit more also about pop entertainment and movies from that you remember.
Absolutely.
And how accurate that seemed to you.
Yeah, I do. I was related to it very much. I must have seen High Noon about 5 times, 6 times as a kid. Every Saturday, and this is the same in Belfast and Derry, where every kid in the city went to the movies on Saturday morning. It was called in our ABC movie theater, it's called ABC Minors, and you would go and you would watch American shows, like Batman and so on, and that was very popular. And of course, Westerns were extremely popular. The cinema was the big escape that everybody went to, and there were many of them. When I was growing up, very popular form. Television, yes, came into it. I mean, television in Ireland we didn't really have a lot of television until the mid 60s. So even going into 1969, television would be in a lot of homes, but in the poor families wouldn't have
Yeah,
a
and
television.
I was actually trying to think because it was like a marker, wasn't it? When he went to someone else's house, they could have television. They had television at like the uncles or the grandparents necessarily.
Yeah, no, that happened to me. We had the first television in our street, and it was a second hand. We got it from the bookies where my father worked, and so we had all the kids from the neighborhood would come and watch the TV, and if they couldn't fit in the room, they were watching through the window, because there was no garden in front of ours. It's just you had the street and the window. Yeah, and that definitely rang true. So those are the things that really got me. I got quite nostalgic. I think Branagh captured that period very well in that sense.
Yeah, and especially media, it's not just the escape of going to movies or watching High Noon, but it was also that was the way you found out like the real stuff about the news stories. We'd talk about the unemployment rate, and then they'd have a discussion about that. They would talk about the violence and show real footage on a TV to show it's not, this one little theatrical neighborhood is just standing in for, devastation throughout. But yeah, the media certainly were ways that I think the Branagh film carefully tries to suggest this is just one little microcosm of these much larger issues, and especially the issue that I know Nicholas had talked about too before of men having to go away to work.
Yes.
Which, as Kate mentions, women are so important here.
Yeah.
So the women are the ones left behind. So when you get that scene with the father saying, "You raised them," and you did a good job, is real significant.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. I mean, that again rang very true to me in my own experience. In the city where I'm from, shirt making was the big industry, and it was all women. They're employed women because they were paid less. And the men were unemployed, and if they had to get work, they had to go to England. And it was mainly people from nationalist or Catholic backgrounds that went to England mostly because of the sectarian sort of setup. Nicholas mentioned the shipyards, and the shipyards employed Protestants only. Catholics
Wow.
were chased out. That was the case in a lot of the big heavy engineering, shipbuilding, and so on that Belfast was famous for. It was not, they didn't employ a lot of Catholics. Those that had to go to England were mostly from a nationalist point of view, although not exclusively, not exclusively.
It's another option. It would be another option. Oh, yeah. Cool. Kate, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's like, sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they do mention this in the movie, that it's like, there are certain streets that are Catholic, certain streets are Protestant. And I think that's another thing that, how the claustrophobia of the movie kind of like keeps you out of any kind of political conversation, because nobody's traversing streets. You don't realize how like shipyards are like, that they are only, their jobs, they're well-paying jobs only available to Protestants, but also like what streets you aren't allowed, like there's ways that you can cut off movement to those shipyards also, by kind of like essentially like occupying certain territory. So the claustrophobia of this like allows him to do a lot more kind of in terms of that fantasy than it would if you do make this a film about Belfast. And I think it's also what's weird about like the book ending with the shipyards, right? Because it's about like flight that kind of goes from like one neighborhood to out and you get to out via other modes of transportation, but you don't really deal with the messiness that is just the local travel.
Right. That's true. And I just wanted to mention that the barricaded streets and those barricades at the head of the street being manned by people looking out for the inhabitants of the street was actually true. It was a very Belfast thing, particularly in there was a peace wall between the Shankill, which was a loyalist Protestant area, and the Falls Road, which was Catholic nationalist. People were burnt out of those streets, and during 1969, 1970, 71, each of those streets had their own little self-defense organization. Organically sort of arose, from the neighbors in each street. So, I recall going to Belfast during that time to visit a friend, and they wouldn't let me in. They didn't know who I was. They didn't believe I was from Derry. I knew her name, and I knew, but they was told, I'm sorry, you can't get into the street. Nobody knows you. We don't know you. So.
No, and certainly for the Branagh movie, he wants to make it like his block was sort of moderate. We were, it was the safe zone. Catholics, you can stay here. Whatever. It was really just to keep the extremists out. Was sort of the image here, and that makes it also again more.
Yeah, and that was absolutely just preposterous. Really, not as implausible. Yeah.
Well, in order, before we wrap up and things, I was just wondering, and I hadn't told people this. I mean, if anybody has like a favorite scene or something that really represents the movie for you, well, in terms of visual style, audio, things like that. But I just think, again, some people, audiences were a little divided about some aspects, and some thought it was a very manipulative movie. Others thought it was very heartfelt and really wonderful. The Guardian has a great review that just says this is perfect stuff. But at least for me, I think a good scene that represents a lot of that is the opening. When it does start with that sort of mythic notion of the family and, hey buddy, come on back for tea, and all the other kids are going back, and you get this sense of the daily routine and how they take care of each other. And then all of a sudden, You know, he's got his little garbage cover, his trash can cover for a shield, that then suddenly get that 360-degree camera movement. I don't know if Sanghoon would encourage students to do those. It almost seems kind of cliche to be in the whirlpool of that. But then you get the thugs coming and the explosions, and the mother by the end of the scene has to use that trash can cover to protect herself and her son from the things being hurled. So I think it's a really good example of how he opens up the theatrical space of being limited to this little street with camera movement, etc. As well. But it also, yeah, for some people they felt like, oh, that's a manipulative scene, and for others, I think it's really part of the power of the movie as well. So I don't know if other people have anything you want to point to that for the value or of what's interesting in the movie, that or any scene you really liked.
Yeah, I think the first scene is that, like you pointed out very nicely. There's also an example of kind of my point, how this film, especially this modern black and white film, combine this fantasy and nostalgia at the same time, because it introduces the time of the era and then where we are. Perfectly good introduction of where what story is going to be unfolded, and at the same time, the movement is very modern. As we don't see that kind of movement in black and white era, 1940s, 1930s, right? Sometimes black and white films has an amazingly modern movement, but
yeah,
so
it's out of an art film. It's something from the art cinema of 60s.
Right. It's very mixed. So I'm looking at black and white film. It feels more like a fantasy, and at the same time nostalgia. So I think that the first scene gives the very good example of those mixture. And when you see those dialogue scenes, and then this film is, I feel like this is also visual plan of the director and DP. We see the very vast wide angle introducing scene, and then we don't have many kind two shot, or if we see the two shot, there is no coverage. We stay in the two shot and done. And then otherwise we see the great close-ups, because they have great actors, Judi Dench and come on, Karen Hines, and everybody's acting was just brilliant, right? And then, like I mentioned a little bit before, so while they're showing this reaction, and then those are dialogue scenes are just brilliant, and then also those dialogue scenes, the editing style and the cinematography composition style is very modern, but at the same time, you're talking about this 1960s Belfast. For example, again, when Buddy was visiting his grandpa, at the hospital, if you see the shot in black and white film, we don't use that kind of a negative space. What I mean by this, if I'm looking at that way, usually character is this way, right? And then this is a very traditional way. But Buddy is composed like this way. He's looking at his grandfather that way. We have a huge negative behind him. That is very modern. And then also it works. So that kind of very modern and contemporary cinematography with a kind of a mix with the black and white, I think gives us, I think I was very impressed overall as a visual design and story.
Yeah, and you had mentioned Ida before, and talk about black and white compositions that don't follow rules and are very modern. Yeah, this
right, yeah,
not as radical as that, but very good. Yeah,
right.
Anybody else have anything they want to point out about the film before we wrap up?
Just one last thing is the character of Kieran Hines, Pop.
Yeah,
I think it was terrific. I recognized other people and Pop, the working class intellectual. He was a very, very wise man, but he didn't have a formal education. There was always, there's always someone like him in every street in Belfast and in the Derry. And I thought, and Kieran Hines is just a terrific actor. I really like that, and I think it'd be remiss if I didn't mention it.
Yeah, I know Nicholas and some other people weren't so thrilled to see Judi Dench. She ends up in everything.
Oh,
but
no.
She brings a lot of other baggage with her in some ways. But what a face. And as Sanghoon said, close-ups, giving her that close-up to say, don't look back, keep going as well, even though she has
they have almost like a 30-year age difference. Did you know that?
Wow.
Judi Dench and they're like almost 30-year difference.
Kieran, yeah. But her accent was awful, but it was, her face, what a face.
All right. Well, I really want to thank the panelists for taking time to do this. Thank all of you out there as well. And I guess it'll be playing on their YouTube channel for the Willson Center later. So thanks again, Tom and Sanghoon. and Kate and Peter. And thanks everybody out there. So if you have other ideas for roundtables, and people should email me. In the fall, we're going to do one on music and soundtracks for sure, but we'll look for another topic as well. So thanks very much, and thanks to Dave Marr for putting this all together for us. All right, take care.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks,
Our next
Richard.
roundtable. Yes. All right. Thanks. Hope to see you all at Cine at some point too.